right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Third Way and Climate Advisors. I'm Jackie Toth of Third Way, and I'll be ushering today's event. All attendees will remain muted on the webinar. Please submit questions throughout the panel discussion using the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. A recording of today's event will be published and emailed to you within the next few days. Now I'd like to turn it over to today's panel moderator, Amy Harder, climate and energy journalist at Axios. Amy?
Hello, good morning, everyone. It is great to be here today, and happy holidays, as happy as this dark year can be, anyway. I really look forward to discussing what climate and clean energy policy might be possible next year as Washington, the new president, and Congress grapple with the pandemic and a recession that's gripping the country and the world. At my perch at Axios, I cover energy and climate policy. So I chatted with Josh just earlier this week, in fact, and I've been covering all these topics a lot over the last several weeks. And I have a weekly Harder Line column that publishes on Monday, and where I hope to be covering some of these issues on Monday, so tune in. And so to that, I'll go to our panelists. And first we have Josh Freed, Senior Vice President for the Climate and Energy Program at the think tank Third Way. Nigel Purvis, CEO of Climate Advisors, a climate policy and communications firm. And Kate Gordon, Director of California Governor's Office of Planning and Research and a Senior Advisor to the Governor Newsom, on climate change. So thank you all for joining us today, and let's dive in. I want to start right with something that I think is on top of everybody's mind, which is the Georgia Senate races, which will determine the control of the Senate. But my question for you is, how much of a difference could that really make when it comes to energy and climate policy? Either way, it appears that the Senate will be closely divided and will make big policy tough regardless. What's your guys' take on the importance of the Georgia Senate races? Nigel, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Amy. That's a great question. I'm an optimist. Democrats won Georgia under the presidential election, and I think we can, progressives can pull it out there. And I think it makes a huge difference, even though it's hard to corral everybody on the Democratic side on climate policy. I think that there is enough going on in our country right now that there will be a consensus around doing something that addresses multiple challenges. We have obviously this historic pandemic, we have enormous unemployment, we have enormous healthcare needs, there's a need to invest in infrastructure, there's great concern about climate action and social justice, and all of those things require investments, and they require solutions that can address multiple problems at once. In addition to that problem, we have this really enormous challenge that state and local governments are facing, and with such a huge loss in revenue as a result of the economic challenges and a huge surge in demand for social services, cities and states are going to be down some $200 billion this year. The bill that the majority is putting forward now, or even the bipartisan group, is less than that, and we're going to see probably a $500 billion gap in state and local spending between now and 2022. And I think the combination of all of those things makes, with a Democratic Senate, makes a big package that addresses multiple problems much more likely than was the case when we were looking at, for example, just climate action 10 years ago, right? So in some sense, if the stars are aligning for a democratic consensus on moving forward in a way that solves those multiple problems. And my organization has partnered with a group called Eco America to come up with a very specific proposal, which I look forward to telling you about in a second.
Great. Kate, since you mentioned the states and the budget shortfalls, can you provide a state perspective, and do you agree with what he said?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. First of all, thanks, Third Way and Josh and Climate Advisors for having me. It is really stark what our budget situation looks like after this year. And just a perspective from California, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. So we really are a significant economy, very diverse. We have oil and gas production. We're the largest manufacturing economy. We obviously have a huge tech sector. So very, very diverse economy that's been extremely hard hit by COVID. But I think the more important point that Nigel's making is the spending point. We are under a budget, balanced budget constraint. And we're right now putting our budget together, our governor's proposed budget together for January, and looking at next year. And it's hard for me to overstate how much we've spent on COVID, and the lack of a second big federal infusion of support has been significant for us. Our safety net programs are just hugely overtaxed. We're spending an enormous amount. But the other piece that's relevant to this conversation is how much we're spending on climate events. So we've had obviously a huge wildfire year. We also had a very significant heat wave earlier this summer. And we have spent $1 billion on firefighting this year. So that's $650 million over budget on firefighting. And by firefighting, I just mean the people and the equipment. I don't even mean forest management or resilience or any of the other pieces of our fire agenda. Our fire season's not over yet. So we're looking at more spending next year. We're looking at potentially going into a drought situation next year. And I'm raising that because obviously it's happening, and sort of goes to your earlier question too. This is happening all over the country. We have a lot of climate events in California, but every part of the country has something significant happening on top of COVID related to the climate. There's been really, really good research recently on the fact that when states are spending on those kinds of climate events, we also end up spending more on social safety net, because when there's a fire, we spend on the fire, we also spend on displacement, on unemployment, on food stamps, on all of the things that go with people being displaced by those events. And I think, it's really, really important to know going into next year that the states are not only incredibly constrained in our budgets because of COVID, incredibly constrained because of these climate events, it's affecting what else we can spend on. So we're making really, really tough choices right now about emergency response versus other climate mitigation dollars. It's not a set of choices we'd like to make, but we've got to balance the budget. And we fully understand in California, we're climate leaders. We understand we have to mitigate to bring down the climate events. But when you're faced with, fires right now, and the need for that level of spending, and you're faced with the hard choices that you make between that and some of our longer term mitigation strategies, there's really, really tough choices. So it's critical to us to see strong support from the federal government at the state level. We have to see actually support for the underlying safety net programs is really important to us, because it allows us to free up more discretionary funding. And then, I would just love to see more support for the kind of resilience spending for climate events that we just don't have any money to do right now.
Great, thanks, Kate. I want to come back to that in a little bit, but Josh, let's turn to you. In terms of the Senate races in Georgia, how pivotal do you think that is to what can be done on energy and climate?
Yeah, I think it's pivotal on energy and climate. And as we heard from both Kate and Nigel, it goes to an even higher level set of questions, which is whether we have a Senate that's interested in the pursuit of power for its own sake, or in solving problems that people are dealing with on a daily basis. The fact that we have, even with the Trump administration right now, that in as much as you can tell what they want to do, seemed willing to have a deal. You had Democrats who were willing to have a deal, and it kept dying over and over again at Mitch McConnell's doorstep, really is stark. And that plays out on big issues that really hurt or help people on a daily basis. And on things that are more prosaic but actually matter on climate change, there's a bill on climate innovation that has been sponsored by Senator Lisa Murkowski, who's the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and Joe Manchin, has wide bipartisan support and could have moved and been voted on at any point over the last at least several months, if not much longer. And we haven't seen it come to the light of day because it hasn't fit within whatever criteria Majority Leader McConnell wants. And it's that combination of problems, because we don't currently have a Senate Majority Leader and a Senate Republican caucus, which dictates what the government actually considers, that takes a step back and says, let's have our conservative principles dictate the frame of the problem solution we're trying to get, but let's actually solve problems and let's negotiate. I mean, it's how the government worked for years and years, and it didn't mean that one party acceded all of their principles to the other. But in the end, you got half a loaf and problems were solved. That's just not happening right now. And it's very asymmetrical because we see that Democrats do want to come to the table and negotiate and figure out how to solve problems. But instead, as a result, whether it's in California or Washington, D.C. or Atlanta or New York, we're also hearing things like mass transit systems that are going to be the lifeblood of returning to normal, and particularly for people who are on the front lines and providing services that you can't provide from work at home like we're all able to do, who have to rely on this every day, they're going to get service cut by 80, 90% because the federal government, in the form of the US Senate, is unwilling to pass any sort of relief bill that includes mass transit, let alone sort of the bigger issues around state and local governments that are facing huge crises. All of these things become climate and clean energy issues when you don't see anything move through the Senate. And it's why the Georgia races are so critically important.
Great, so let's kind of dig in a little bit to sort of the first big topic that will be on President-elect Biden's agenda, and of course also what the Congress is debating today as well. I mean, I'm hearing rumblings, and I'm sure you guys are as well, that some specific climate and energy things could actually move before the end of the year. So, and Nigel, you mentioned a specific plan, so maybe we can start with you on this question, but I'll get to the others. What are sort of the top 2 or 3 specific climate and energy policies that you think could pass in a sort of broader economic stimulus package?
Well, so Amy, as I mentioned, I think we need solutions that address not only this broad agenda of the economy and healthcare and the climate crisis, but we need to do so in a way that involves the local, state and local communities and builds political power for that agenda so that there is more bipartisanship around those solutions. And if we get just a stimulus bill, if the solution that the Biden administration comes up with is just a single shot, I feel like it won't be sufficient to really address the depth of these challenges. Climate change is going to be something that we're not going to solve in a single year. Even it took 10 years to get past the painful shadow of the last financial crisis. So we need to think of this as an opportunity for long-term investments. And so the solution that we propose and I'll explain why I think this, in answer to your question, why this is politically realistic, is something that we call ARCHES. And this is a proposal that you can find on our website, Climate Advisors. ARCHES stands for the American Recovery for Climate, Health, and Economic Stability. As the name suggests, ARCHES is meant to be a bridge to the future, right? It's a way to get us past this painful moment and to really invest. And the centerpiece of ARCHES is a $2.3 trillion investment over 10 years, of which $1.7 trillion would go to cities and states for them to decide how to address their local priorities, right? And our government works best when it governs locally, when it adopts those principles of federalism. And the ARCHES would get that money out to cities and states using block grants, which is a policy mechanism that has worked in so many different other areas, whether it's addressing poverty, childhood poverty, or infrastructure spending. It's the cities and states who are given funding by the federal government so that they can decide what really are the priorities locally. And one of the things that will be politically relevant, Amy, is how do you pay for these kinds of investments? And we're hearing increasingly, as I'm sure you know, that from conservatives that they're concerned about the deficit and the debt. And so our proposal, ARCHES, pays for itself. And the way it would do that is with a carbon fee that would begin at $52 a ton and would escalate at 6% a year, with the revenue being divided 75% for cities and states and 25% for local government. What that would do is cut US climate pollution in half in 10 years, while funding the sustained investments in healthcare, infrastructure, and all of the other priorities that Kate mentioned that cities and states have around the country. We know that carbon fees are popular with the American people. The latest polls show that 73% of all Americans support carbon fees, and even a majority of Republicans, 55% in the latest Pew Research Center survey, support carbon fees. And concern about climate change because of the fires and the hurricanes has never been greater than it has before. So, to answer your question, what could the Congress actually do? Well, if Democrats win both seats in the Senate, this is something they could do, I think, relatively easily, because It's a measure that's about raising money and spending money, and therefore would be eligible to be passed through budget reconciliation, which would only require a simple majority in the Senate. And I think that with defined so broadly, with support from governors and mayors around the country and addressing so many different challenges, I think we would finally have an opportunity to put carbon pricing in place in a way that addresses the investment needs of this political moment.
So are you shopping that around to get a sponsor in Congress, and how is that going?
Yeah, so we're just starting. We've just published the paper, just done the analysis, and the outreach is going to be a lot easier after the results of the Georgia election if they go well, and it certainly would be harder if the results there are not as I hope they will be. So I think the outreach phase is about to begin.
Kate, is that something that Governor Newsom supports?
I mean, we haven't seen the proposal, so I can't obviously comment. I will say we, of course, have the largest pricing system for carbon in California. And in fact, right now, our cap and trade system, combined with our low carbon fuel standards and other standards, which I know we'll be talking about, we really do take an approach in California that's a price plus standards approach. And it's been very effective. I will say a couple things about Nigel's point. I think the point about block grants is a really important one, that if there's one thing that we absolutely know about energy and climate is it's a deeply geographically, culturally, and economically specific issue. There isn't one answer to the right approach, whether it's dealing with immediate climate impacts or thinking about emissions reductions in most parts of the state. It's very local. So we in general really like the idea, and we're a co-chair of the U.S. Climate Alliance with 24 other states, and together wrote a letter last year. No, it wasn't last year. It feels like it was last year. It was probably 6 months ago. Wrote a letter about the need for additional stimulus that really made the point that that states and local governments have to be able to make some of these choices themselves. That we'd really like to see an approach that allows for that kind of bottom up and regional diversity. I think an important note on that, and something that we would like to see, and we are looking at in California, particularly coming off of a big task force we just convened around jobs and economic recovery, is the application of sort of broadly shared criteria to a stimulus money that goes out. One thing that is increasingly clear is that, and I think this is the approach President-elect Biden is taking, is that every part of the government, every agency, every department is a climate department at some level, that there's the decisions being made have to be made with an eye to this. Climate change is a macroeconomic issue like globalization. It affects everything. And I think we have to look at all recovery dollars with an eye toward that, and we've been supporters, and California's looking at climate risk disclosure with an eye toward really an overlay of climate preparedness, both in terms of physical risk and in terms of the transition to a carbon neutral economy, and looking at everything in terms of equity, the actual impact the policies have on the most disadvantaged communities. I think that's incredibly important. Something we just did in California that I think is relevant is our COVID approach in terms of county. We have a county level COVID approach. So every county is on a sort of a set of metrics, and we say if your county reaches a certain number of cases, new cases per 1,000 or 10,000, then you kind of go into a new tier, right? And we ask counties to make that determination based on their most disadvantaged populations. We don't let them average out over the whole county. We actually have a health equity metric that says only when the most disadvantaged parts of your county have reached those levels that are strong levels in terms of COVID, can you move down a tier? Can you open up your restaurants? Can you open up your schools? That's significant because of the unequal distribution, as you know, of those impacts. I think we need to take that kind of approach in general with recovery spending to say, not only does it have to be bottom up and like different things work for different regions of the country, but we need to do it with an eye at the very beginning to disproportionate impacts. We don't tend to do that in this kind of spending, and I just think this moment we're in, looking at the opening up of inequality, just the stark kind of reality of the current system not working and not being very resilient under COVID, has really opened our eyes, I think, to the need to apply those kinds of standards across the board. The last thing I'll say really briefly, Amy, is just on the point about revenue, you know, it's been incredibly helpful in California that we have a cap and trade system that has a separate revenue stream coming out of it that we use to spend on our climate policies. That because it's not part of our budget discussion, it's separate, and so it doesn't get as affected. We can't rate it essentially, which is good. So let me just say it is very helpful for us to have dedicated revenue. However, having dedicated revenue can lead to governments thinking that the only revenue they have to deal with climate issues is that dedicated revenue. And I will say, again, every dollar we spend has to be spent with an eye to climate at this point, given the impacts, given the realities. So I think it's just cautionary note. We can't separate this out as an issue in terms of revenue, in terms of policy, in a way that distances it from the rest of our decision making and the rest of our economy.
Great, thanks, Kate. Josh, I want to turn to you and ask, what kind of policies do you think are possible in the broader economic stimulus discussion? And do you think something like a carbon fee is possible?
Yeah, look, I think Kate's point on the Biden approach being a real whole of government approach and seeing climate less moved as one large bill or a discrete set of climate bills, but being part of not just a recovery or series of recovery packages, but everything from surface transportation reauthorization to housing and urban development planning and on, as well as seeing from within the administration, including metrics around data collection. So we get a much better sense of what activities are having an impact both on carbon emissions, but also how the climate impacts that we're all dealing with on a daily basis are affecting both certain different populations differently, but also different geographies. I mean, we see part of the challenge right now is also that we see certain parts of the country who feel much more impacted and invested in addressing climate change than others, even though, as we all know, if you're in the Midwest and you're dealing with either a derecho or flooding or polar vortexes that have all been enhanced by climate change, you're still facing both the adverse impacts of it directly, but then also you're paying for it. You're paying for it in infrastructure damage, in the cost of insurance and recovery and everything else. But the government hasn't been thinking about that in all of its policy solutions and also its data collection. So we need to really start doing that so that you're not having 1 or 2 or 5 fights a year over climate policy. It's just simply really embedded in everything that we're doing. I think that would make a big change in how much we can get done and how we think about it. You know, in terms of the way we hope the Biden administration and Congress will approach this, look, we've got, before we address anything else comprehensively, we've got to get the pandemic under control. And we've got to get a baseline of economic stability back. I mean, we have 2 economies right now. We've got the economy of all of us and people who have jobs where we can work remotely, who work either in the tech sector or you know, think tanks and so on and so forth, where we're doing fine. I mean, you know, there was, I think it was Axios this morning covered the insane increase in prices in homes now, where even starter homes are being priced out for people who traditionally buy them because there is a set of the economy and people that are doing okay. The rest of the economy is doing awful and getting worse, and it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. So those are things we've got to really address. And if we include climate and clean energy in those investments, then we can start having the public recognize that that kind of spending directly impacts them in a positive way. We're entering a dangerous phase, for example, where we're seeing more and more that an issue like hydraulic fracturing is becoming a values issue. There are the majority of voters are skeptical of it, but they don't vote on that issue. If you live in a community, we're finding where your job is directly or indirectly, but clearly related to fracking, there's a cohort of voters that are voting just on trying to protect their jobs because it is a direct economic issue. We need to start breaking those bonds from happening before it gets to cement it in. In terms of your question about a carbon fee, look, I mean, I've been involved in the climate and clean energy advocacy space for a long time, and in politics since Newt Gingrich first came to national public attention way back in the 90s. And you know, I'm not holding my breath at all. We are neutral on whether there should be a price on carbon through you know, some sort of congressional action, especially in the near term. And I think the key thing first is, let's get the investment out there. Let's show that's working. Let's accelerate the deployment of technologies, and let's set the standards so that we have both government and the private sector knowing what they need to reach. And at that point, I think it'll be easier to put a carbon price on. But I think that trying to put a carbon price into play, you know, particularly in the teeth of this recession and the pandemic, is I'm massively skeptical that it's at all feasible.
Nigel, do you want to respond to that?
I'd love to. So, you know, I think when we think about carbon pricing, we think about it as if it's the end itself, there's no way there's enough political support, even probably within the Democratic Party. And we saw that from the cap and trade debates of a decade ago. Where we are now, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, is that there are a huge number of challenges that require massive investments, and they're not one time, let's get a green stimulus passed in the first 100 days. It's a long-term agenda that needs to be addressed. And so the right policy is one that promotes investments for several years. And you know, the Republicans were willing to use reconciliation to get the Trump tax cuts through. Obama was willing to use reconciliation powers to get Obamacare through. And I think the Biden administration and you know, what would be Majority Leader Schumer, if in fact the Georgia goes for the Democrats, would be willing to use reconciliation to help create the investments needed to get the economy back on its feet and to serve those communities of color and those the folks who are suffering in this K-shaped recovery and are not able to do what we're doing here, which is to be able to work despite the pandemic. You know, they really need sustained assistance, and a single bill won't do that. So, you know, what I think the last 10 or 20 years of politics in the Senate in particular have shown is that when you have the majority, you do what you need to, and you treat it as a special moment where you can get something through and you get everything possible through. So the question is, would they try? I think they actually would consider trying. And you know, probably, Amy, that there's been a lot of research done by think tanks and a lot of quiet discussions about what's possible through reconciliation. And should the Georgia seats go for the Democrats, I think that there would be a real discussion, not about climate policy, but about how you pay for the other policy. Right, and to be able to have a sustained investment. And under those circumstances, am I certain it would happen? No, but I think it would be more likely than at any point in the last 10 years. And so it's a policy debate we should be having.
Great, thanks. And just a reminder to the audience, thank you to everybody who's tuning in. You'll be able to ask questions of the panelists in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So please be putting in your questions into the chat function, and Jackie will monitor that and facilitate the questions in a little while. One sort of comment I'm really noticing among all of you is that climate needs to be embedded into everything, you know, which I understand, but you know, this talk of deep carbonization, which is something that I know all of you are focusing on, is really a different can of worms than just, you know, making sure public transit is back on track, for example. So can you address what I see as a disconnect between investing in the technologies that get us to deep carbonization, like hydrogen and things like that, to the imminent jobs crisis that we have and economic crisis we have? Investing in hydrogen now is not going to create a job tomorrow. Can you guys talk about how you're viewing that in your respective roles?
And I'll go to that, Amy, because we're obviously thinking about it in California. I mean, we come into this conversation with, of course, you know, more than 10 years of a structure in which our economy already prices carbon and has a set of standards both on the carbon content of fuel and on the carbon content of our electricity. So we have a very we're sort of in some ways sort of a poster child, I feel like, of what happens if you have the framework of if you're in this economy, you need to think about carbon and what that actually means when you're looking at implementation on the ground. And let me just say at an outset, I think this is really, really important because there's a lot of conversation about just transition right now and about what it will look like to transition to a carbon neutral economy or a net zero economy, which more and more economies are calling for. Your point about not being a job today is just true across the board. That's true of all economic transformations and all economic development approaches. This is a long-term proposition of diversifying our economy across the board, looking at regionally specific solutions to doing that, looking at opportunities, not just clean energy opportunities, but opportunities, again, to green the entire economy, opportunities to think about embedding carbon, reducing climate risk and capturing opportunity across every single sector. I remember talking about this a few years ago about kind of the concept of green jobs, which, Amy, as you know, I've been kind of a veteran of. And you know, it's sort of like saying there's a set of tech sector jobs that's separate from the rest of the economy. But like, what about the police officer who uses an onboard system to look up a driver's license number? That's a tech job, but it's a police officer. That's really what we're talking about, is that every single sector and every region needs to be thinking about what a transition to carbon neutrality looks like for that sector and region, needs to be looking at the opportunities to get there, and needs to be looking at the risks that they're facing now in terms of the physical impacts of climate and the risk of not moving fast enough. So we really see opportunity kind of across the board, but we're just encouraging everyone to think much more broadly from the experience we have in California of doing this for kind of a long time. This isn't about you shut down an industry tomorrow and then magically there's a bunch of jobs that appear because of technology investment. That's just not the way the economy works. It's thinking ahead about looking forward, looking ahead to potential decline based on market conditions, based on projections we have in California. Of course, that's oil and gas is the big sector we're looking at on that because we have a production sector. Thinking about what that looks like over the next decade or beyond, thinking about what is possible to decarbonize and what isn't as easy to decarbonize over the next decade and beyond on the electricity side, and managing that transition so that as we're doing capital stock turnover, we're doing it in a way that's decarbonized. As we're doing training and job and apprentice program investments on the labor side, we're doing it in a way that's paying attention to demand side growth. Where do we actually see potential demand across what sectors and what are we training for? So it's really kind of again, it's an all of government approach. But I just want to say one more time, because I think it's a fundamental mistake that we make when we talk about just transition or the transition to carbon neutrality. It is not a one-for-one replacement of a set of jobs to another set of jobs. We are talking about moving from an economy based on extraction, refining, transportation of materials that have to continuously come out of the ground to an economy that's based on primarily a set of energy generation that we don't mine, solar and wind and hydro and geothermal, that is primarily about capital investments in large systems to capture that energy, and then not that many people dealing with it once it's been captured. I used to work with someone on the Risky Business Project, Greg Page, the former head of Cargill, who said, and I always think this is a really apt way to put it, we're talking about replacing fuel with capital. Our economy has been primarily based on jobs around fuel and extraction of various kinds of fuels and resources. We're talking about replacing that with an economy based primarily on a huge amount of capital expenditure and then jobs managing that system. It's a different kind of economy. It's going to take a lot of thought to how we do that transition, and it's not going to happen overnight.
And to build on what Kate's saying, I think a couple of other points is it requires rethinking the approach across how we develop policy, the direction we want to take the economy, and how we then expend money now. You know, an example that is related to, but not directly on the extraction and burning of fossil fuels is, how do we determine and prioritize what money is spent around surface roads and bridges? You know, right now, the federal government in its transportation expenditures has a bias towards building new roads and bridges. And that results in more cars on the road, more vehicle miles traveled, and more carbon emissions. you can actually get more jobs created more quickly, and the roads and bridges that we have that need to be fixed first, if you approach the expenditures by a fix-it-first method. So you say, okay, before you start building new roads and bridges, let's repair what you have and make sure that the backlog gets reduced. It actually also means more jobs more quickly, because you don't have to go through the same permitting and engineering process. You can actually get construction workers on the ground repairing all of this backlog of infrastructure much more quickly. And it hasn't been considered a climate policy, but it actually has the knock-on effect of being a climate policy. And it's the difference between thinking about all of this as part of a political economy in part, rather than a environmental issue. And I think that we need to have that shift in thinking about decarbonization as it's a political economy question, not an environmental question or purely a climate question.
I just have to say really quickly that in California, we do think of it as a climate policy. The governor a year ago put out an executive order asking our Department of Transportation to align all of our asset investments in our system with our climate policies, including taking a fix-it-first approach. Because building new road capacity automatically increases vehicle miles traveled. There's thousands of studies back to Robert Moses that say that. And so that's a big part of our transportation system. We don't talk about that much. It's a state issue more than a federal issue. There's stuff the federal government can do to help us on it. But it is a clear part of how we need to address transportation decarbonization. So really, really agree with Josh.
I mean, and Kate, Buy Clean is another good example of something that California has taken the lead on, where there are both, you can start to have immediate impacts in terms of planning and anticipation of where, particularly if the federal government implemented it, where procurement from the federal government was going to go in terms of building materials and other things, where we could start having lower carbon content building materials prioritized and purchased, and know that there's going to be demand for it and the jobs will be moving that way. Depending on how it's done, if it's also paired with Buy America, you can also see a lot of those industries and jobs start to move back onshore or expand in the United States. There are challenges with how much purchasing power the federal government has, but it can be a real signal in the right direction. And it's something that in part the Biden administration can do, going back to your previous question, of actions that hopefully we see in the first year or two of the administration.
Amy, I want to answer the question you asked, which, as I recall, was how do we deal with the fact that some of the things we need to do on the energy investment side are long-term, like investing in fundamental technologies, and with the short-term need of putting people back to work. And I think it's important to remember what I think of as one of the primary lessons of the effort to grow out of the financial crisis, for the $1 trillion that was approved by the Congress for what was known as the TARP back then. Some of the most successful programs were not so much about inventing new technologies, but they were about diffusing the technologies that already work and are available, if only they could be implemented more quickly. And that's what I think the Biden administration is going to want to do. So they have a very ambitious goal, for example, on the electrification of the transportation sector, and particularly the passenger vehicle fleet. And that's going to require investments in charging infrastructure and in battery infrastructure, so that we can take away the range anxiety that people have, be able to develop fast charging opportunities for people so that it's more electric vehicles are more convenient. The prices for electric vehicles are already coming down, but together with some additional tax incentives, if that infrastructure were in place, we would see a transformation of that sector, our fastest growing, largest sector of our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that in this instance, that tension between long-term R&D and deployment is not as great as it would be from an employment standpoint. I think the bias is towards employment, and that's where the jobs are. So I think that that's good. But it is a multi-year effort, and that's why I would come back to, both Kate and Josh are talking about this transformation of our entire economy, and thinking of it not as solely or even inherently as an environmental challenge, but really more as an economic challenge to grow green. And that's not something that we're going to do with a single green stimulus plan, which is why we need to have, if there is Democratic control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, we need to be considering proposals like Arches that would pay for these interventions for a decade rather than just a single shot. And I think we would really regret squandering that moment of power in Washington on a single year fix. There need to be longer term solutions, and that's, I hope that there'll be debate in the Congress if the Georgia elections go to the Democrats about that, because it would be such a lost opportunity to just fix the immediate year of fiscal gap for states and cities rather than putting them on a long-term path to growth. You know, last time we invested in Wall Street rather than Main Street with the financial crisis recovery, and this time we need to invest in Main Street. And I think we can do that with block grants, and a program that puts in place large-scale block grants for climate investments and jobs would be the right policy at this point.
I want to ask a question that we've sort of touched on a couple of different ways about, you know, environmental injustice and environmental racism and the just transition and jobs. I mean, it's all sort of connected in different ways. And so something that I'll be watching more is, you know, and Kate, you mentioned this, that the way, you know, the clean economy is capital, not fuels, and requires a lot fewer people to handle a solar or wind farm is a lot fewer people than a coal mine, for example. And I think one obvious upshot of that is that there's far fewer unions representing renewable energy interests than there are in the fossil fuel space. And of course, unions are very important to President-elect Biden. And of course, you know, in some of these communities in Texas, for example, there's a lot of communities of color that are working in oil and gas jobs. And so it's just sort of all connected in different ways. And so how do you guys handle and think about both the fact that, you know, lower income and communities of color often face the brunt of climate change and pollution, but also, and which is really relevant today, they often pay a disproportionate amount of their income on energy. Just yesterday I was talking with Congressman Mark Vesey, a Democrat in Texas, and I asked him about a carbon price, and he said he's not opposed to it, but that his concern is that, you know, communities like his would, you know, face the brunt of higher prices with that. So how do you handle the double-edged sword that certain communities face?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that question. Let me unpack it just a little bit. So I'm really honored that in his last executive order, the one that got a lot of attention for calling for only new zero emission vehicle sales by 2035, the governor also called for my office to work with our labor department on a just transition roadmap for the state of California. We don't currently have one. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about this very question. And I should say, when we say just transition, which is frankly has become kind of a problematic term, I think, because different people have assigned different meanings to it, but I'll just use it since people know it. We really don't only mean what happens to the workers currently in those jobs. We also mean what happens to the workers who have not traditionally been able to get into those jobs. There's a lot of people, particularly in Black and brown communities, who have not been able to access the jobs in the current energy economy that in many cases are unionized and are very stable. So a couple of things. One, I'm not necessarily saying that it's a net loss to transition from a fuel-based to a capital-based economy. We can create a lot of jobs on the construction side. We've actually found in an analysis of our cap and trade program spending over the last 15 years, 60% of the jobs we've created have been in construction. As long as construction jobs are on big projects and ongoing and people are trained into, you know, frankly, mostly union building trades, that's a stable job. One of the things about being in a union in construction is that when your current project ends, you're still in the union, you still have healthcare, you still have benefits, you transition to another project, you're not constantly losing your job and then coming back and getting another job. That's partly why that structure is so important and why union jobs, even in construction, are so much better than non-union jobs in construction. So I think that paying attention to job quality, not just job quantity from the very beginning, is a critical part of doing this transition. And the other thing, just to your point about kind of communities that have been left out, and building on what Nigel said about this being fundamentally an economic approach and not an environmental approach. In the environmental regulatory context, when we think about disadvantaged communities, we tend to think about communities sort of as a static thing. How is that community, what are the pollution levels of that community? How has that community had, you know, structural issues that lead to higher asthma rates, whatever? and we look at attacking that problem. If you take an economic approach to this issue, your question is actually, how do we transform that out of being a disadvantaged community? How do you think about access to opportunity and jobs and to a more diversified economy overall that allows for a more inclusive approach, right? So I think that's really, really important as we go forward here. We can't divorce our climate policies from looking at job quality, looking at issues of access and inclusion, and essentially saying, when that transition happens, how do we make sure that we're not creating a new set of people who have crappy jobs? I mean, frankly, this is partly what we've done in the past. Again, using my own state as an example, when our timber industry went into decline 20, 30 years ago, you know, not that different from a climate decline, honestly. I mean, it went into decline because of a combination of policies and globalization and regulatory approaches. We didn't really do a just transition strategy. And we went from having a set of communities in the forested part of the state that were actually doing pretty well to having a set of communities that have the lowest graduation rates, the highest opioid rates, the lowest wages of any part of California. We're now looking at trying to figure out ways to take our forest management approaches of all the wood we're taking out of the forest and combine that with an economic development strategy around things like cross-laminated timber, which is a climate strategy in and of itself. That's 20 years later than we should have done it, to be honest. We now don't have the infrastructure to do that. We don't have a lot of sawmills anymore in California. We don't have a lot of forest roads anymore in California. So what we're really saying is, look, let's not create a new set of disadvantaged communities. Let's actually raise the bar overall. Let's make sure that we are not putting things in place that inadvertently undermine an economic approach that needs to lift all boats. And I'll give one more example of that, and something we often inadvertently do in environmental policy. And I think it's really material. One of the things about resource dependent communities is that their tax bases are very dependent on that resource. So you look at kind of stark examples of Texas and Wyoming and other big resource states. In California, looking by county, Kern County, which is our biggest oil producing county, 9 out of its top 10 taxpayers, property taxpayers, are oil and gas companies. We have a policy put in place over a decade ago in California that big solar farms don't have to pay property taxes. It was part of how we incentivized the development of big solar. We are now telling Kern County to replace their oil jobs with solar jobs, which would mean a replacement of a tax-paying industry with a non-tax-paying industry. That's a significant issue for the county because those property taxes are what pays for its hospitals and its roads.
Are you planning on repealing or changing that law and taxing the solar companies?
We're definitely looking at it. It's not as easy as you would think, and no commitment yet to change it. This has sort of just come up as an issue. The Board of Supervisors just wrote a memo about it last week. I think it's just an important example because sometimes when we're pushing a new set of industries, we inadvertently put in place lower labor standards, lower tax bases. We kind of wave aside some of our trade requirements, and we just need to think ahead about that because these will be in place for a long time.
I want to get very briefly to Nigel and Josh, but I also want to make sure we have about 4 questions in the queue, and I would love for Jackie to take that over. Nigel and Josh, do you guys have any quick comments to what I realize is a very big question?
Yeah,
just
sorry, Josh. Yeah, environmental equity or climate justice is an incredibly important topic, and I'm so glad that our community is paying more attention to it as we should. We haven't paid enough attention to it. You're absolutely right, Amy, that when you ask a member like to raise the prices for your community in order to address the global problem called climate change, that's a hard decision to make. But that's the wrong way to frame the question. I think and that's how environmentally we've typically done it. So that wasn't a comment about you, that was about our community has not done a very good job of framing what the choices are. And the choices ought to be, do you want to invest in your community and create opportunities and jobs and justice? And by the way to do that is through this policy that will raise which will rebalance the energy sector in a way that will reduce pollution for your community. And if we are able to reframe the opportunity, I think there will be a consensus in the Democratic Party that for carbon pricing and for policies that address environmental justice while accelerating the clean energy transformation. So I think the environmental justice community is right to call us to take their concerns more seriously. And I think when we do, we will have more political power rather than less, because there will be a stronger groundswell of support. But we can't just look to the left. If there is a Democratic majority in the Senate, it's going to be razor thin, and we'll need every vote. And that means really appealing to moderates in the middle as well. And I think the way to do that is to show that policies are paying for themselves and that we're not exploding the debt, that we have an opportunity to make some investments that are needed in order to deal with this enormous challenge, but we're going to do it in a fiscally responsible manner and that has the support of industry that's looking for certainty. So I do think there's a ability to do that, and particularly if mayors and governors are on board because they see block grants coming their way and they have a huge fiscal crisis. I think you're going to get moderate Republicans for whom climate change is not as polarizing an issue at the state and local level as it is here in Washington, willing to say, yeah, if you're going to give me that block grant, I'd be very happy to support a policy that is going to, make it possible for me to maintain my level of investment in social programs, education, and other priorities that the pandemic has really heightened the importance of. So,
I don't want to cut you off there, but we are, I definitely want to get to the questions. Josh, is it okay if I jump to questions now? If you have something.
Just two quick things. One is, I think there's a lot that can be done immediately that the climate and environmental policy has made a mistake in the past. We all have in thinking that these things are rank ordered or focused just or primarily on the climate side. I think with the Biden administration, you're going to see equity and inclusion really focused on an environmental justice throughout the policymaking. So questions about where investment, for example, in innovation goes, will also include regional and, looking at the regions to make sure it's not all focused in certain regions, to look at our HBCUs and institutions that historically have served Hispanic and other communities actually getting research grants in a way that they haven't in the past. And also start to really press the renewable sector to start unionizing. The announcement that Ørsted made recently, big offshore wind company, that they have an MOU with the steelworkers. All of their offshore wind in the United States is going to be unionized, and they're going to try to unionize the supply chain as much as they can in the US. That's a big change, and I think you're going to see more of that with the Biden administration.
Great. I am going to hand it back to Jackie now. We have about 5 questions in the queue, and please be asking more. I think we've addressed some of these already, so maybe Jackie can kind of pick the ones that we have not addressed. So back to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Amy. Great. To start off our Q&A session, I'll open this one to any of our panelists. We have a question here on what the impacts are of pension funds' decision to disinvest in the companies contributing to climate change. I think you all have seen that yesterday the New York State Controller said their pension fund will drop a lot of its fossil fuel stocks in the next 5 years and take additional steps to sell shares in climate polluting companies by 2040.
I mean, this is something I'll speak to. We're looking at in California. We our 2 pension funds, or we have 3 major pension funds. 2 of them are very, very big. All 3 together, $700 billion in investments. The governor just put out a climate investment framework we've been working on for about a year, asking those working with the pensions, which we do not direct. Unlike New York, California does not direct its pensions. We are working with them to look at a set of approaches to incorporate climate risk and opportunity into thinking. And the one thing I'll say on this is we've taken an approach in California that is less about divestment from a specific set of companies and more about, and this is a common theme you'll hear from me, more about looking across all investments at where are the risks, both from physical climate change, what are the risks to assets, to major capital intensive assets from climate events, and how are investors and asset owners dealing with those risks, and also how are asset owners and investors dealing with the risk of not getting ahead of the transition to carbon neutrality. So we're really looking, the governor's asked us to form a work group on climate risk disclosure. We're really looking at a portfolio-wide approach rather than an individual set of company divestment approach. But I do think New York has shown incredible leadership and is really impressive to watch.
Yeah, and Kate, that's a really important point that we need to have a serious discussion about climate risk across all investments. It's something that we've seen some of the folks at the Fed start to talk about, some of the folks at the Securities Exchange Commission talk about. hopefully with the new administration as well, there will be more consideration about what disclosures need to be provided so that we don't think about it only as an issue that, it's the oil and gas industry or extraction companies that are exposed, and look across everyone's portfolio in all of the sectors and companies to really understand how climate risk immediately and over the long term is going to change the financial calculus on what companies are viable, what sectors are viable, and you'll see pension funds and others make much more informed decisions on that. And also, I think will help inform policymakers far better than we have today.
Well, and I'll just say to Nigel's point he's been making, it is a form of pricing. If we actually incorporate risks and opportunities into our decision making, it does create a form of pricing across the entire economy.
Thank you. I'll direct this next audience question to Nigel. The Federal Power Act is broad enough, we could potentially do a carbon fee through FERC. Why not there instead of Congress?
Yeah, so I'm not a FERC expert, but I will say that you need the Congress to be able to spend money, and I think our immediate priority right now is making investments. So I would prefer a policy like Arch's that provides an opportunity to make the investments over a decade needed to both reduce pollution and create jobs. If it should prove that we don't have a majority in the Senate, we're not able to get pricing through, I think it's worth looking at other options as well.
Thank you. How do you all envision the federal government helping or enabling local communities to transition toward green energy? And they say, is this done by increasing educational materials about a clean energy transition, revamping infrastructure in favor of green energy, shifting subsidies toward greener technologies? Open that to the group.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that from the federal government side, it really needs to be a whole of government approach. And so, investment, and specifically investment around clean energy actions, is a critical part of it, especially now where you've got so many local and state governments that are facing enormous both budget deficits and also just a backlog of infrastructure investment, not just in roads and bridges, but also if you look, across the country in far too many places, water infrastructure has been neglected for decades and on and on. But it's also in data collection. I mean, one of the things that we've heard a lot about is even state departments of transportation, let alone local departments of transportation, they simply are understaffed and under-resourced. And they can't measure, for example, a lot of the implications of the road projects that they have on what the emissions are going to be, what even traffic flows are going to look like. I mean, they're using modeling for that is 30, 40 years old in some cases, that just is inadequate for the moment. So I think that you can have the federal government both provide funding, but also provide a lot more expertise and data across all of the activities, because this really, climate is really touches all parts of the economy, and we can start treating it that way and arming governments that are really under-resourced to make better decisions and to help them pay for it.
And some of that is just about modeling. We've taken a regulatory approach with transportation, where our California Environmental Quality Act analysis of transportation projects, our environmental impact reports, we've just shifted the way that they measure environmental impact from an old metric, frankly, on traffic congestion, to a new metric on vehicle miles traveled. So we now analyze how much more additional vehicle traffic will be created by all transportation projects. That's a significant advance in terms of tying climate to our transportation system, and that's a regulatory fix, not a legislative one.
Jackie, one of the questions in the queue is on foreign policy, and that's an area I specialize in. I'd like to just discuss that. So, the question was about what is the Biden administration going to do to cooperate with the European Union on climate? And we just saw this week, actually, the External Affairs Division of the European Commission, which is their foreign policy arm, issued a white paper describing what they think of as the new transatlantic agenda to work on with the Biden administration. And climate change was front and center. But what was really interesting is that more than has ever been the case before, climate change was tied to other aspects of the European vision of foreign policy. So they wanted to integrate climate into trade. They want to integrate climate into security cooperation. There's just a broad mainstreaming of the climate agenda in Europe. And we're going to see a lot of emphasis in their dialogue with the Biden administration, with John Kerry in his new role in the White House, advising the president-elect on the foreign policy issues of climate change. We're going to just see a lot more emphasis from our allies, and there's going to be a strong desire to work with the administration, because as long as we don't have a consensus nationally on climate change, they're going to want to do as much as they can when they have a climate-friendly White House. So one of the things that the Financial Times just reported this week, that the French foreign minister said that one of the priorities that they're going to have for the Biden administration is carbon tax. They have had a carbon tax in Europe for more than a decade. It's working. They want coordination and harmonization of policies across all industrialized countries. So we will be getting pressure from our allies to make climate change a top priority, and that will include in adopting pricing on carbon.
Great. Well, we're at the hour. I think we'll close it there, but thank you to all of our attendees for joining us and to our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.